My name is Clara Voss. I teach comparative literature at the university, and most of my life has been defined by patterns, by soft, consistent rhythms that gave structure to the chaos of the world. My days usually start with a quiet cup of coffee, a worn novel cracked open on my lap, and the sound of the city below echoing against the old windows of our apartment at Waverly Heights. I've always found comfort in order, predictability. It's not exciting, but it's safe. That's why I married Elias. He wasn't dramatic or poetic like the characters in the books I taught. He was measured, reliable, brilliant with his hands, and maddeningly calm under pressure. He was an engineer, always speaking in numbers and function, while I lived in metaphor and mood. But I liked that contrast. We balanced each other. Every Sunday for the past 5 years, Elias drove out of the city to visit his parents in Thorn Hollow. It was a quiet hamlet on the edge of the woods, all foggy mornings and moss-covered roofs, the kind of place time passed slowly. I'd never been particularly close to his family, but I always sent food. My pickled vegetables, spiced pear jam, lentil stew in thermoses that still steamed by the time he arrived. He said they loved my cooking. That was enough for me. Elias always came home with dirt under his nails, a few stories about his dad's apple trees, or the neighbor's dog, and a tired but content look in his eyes. I listened. I smiled. I believed every word. Why wouldn't I lately, though? Something had shifted. It wasn't that he stopped being kind. He still brought me morning coffee, still kissed my shoulder when I sat reading on the couch, still read me poetry before bed. Though sometimes I had to prompt him, but there was a fog behind his eyes now, like a window left unwashed. He would stare too long at the skyline or linger at the door before leaving for work. Once or twice, I caught him holding his phone longer than usual. Thumb paused mid-text. Jaw tense, I chalked it up to stress. He was leading a complicated infrastructure project and hadn't taken time off in months. I didn't want to pressure him. Instead, I tried harder. I cooked more, cleaned more. I even took up gardening on the windowsill herbs. Mostly, though, the basil never made it past week 2. Then one Saturday morning, I woke up with a strange impulse. I wanted to surprise him. He'd already left early for work, a rare Saturday on site. The apartment was filled with soft golden light as I moved through the kitchen, opening the fridge, and pulling out a few jars I'd prepared the week before. Tomato jam, garlic pickles. A small apple tart I'd made late at night while listening to Chopin. I lined them on the table, then added 2 slices of meatloaf, a container of mushroom stew, and a tin of sweet biscuits. Elias's father had once called a small miracle. I could picture their faces, his mother's gentle surprise, his father's quiet smile. They always welcomed me even if I visited rarely. This would make their day. It would make Elias's day. It would remind him that I wasn't just watching from the sidelines. I was in this marriage, present and loving. I slipped on my favorite jeans and a dark wool coat, then wrapped a scarf around my neck. Autumn had arrived quietly this year with crisp air and a sky painted in soft watercolors. I packed everything into a canvas bag, careful to wrap the glass jars in linen, then carried it down the stairs of our building. The air outside smelled of wood smoke and damp leaves. The wind carried a slight chill that made my fingers sting as I opened the trunk of the car and placed the bag inside. Our old Neva started on the second try. As I pulled out into traffic, I felt light-free. There was something about doing something unannounced, something generous that made me feel like the old versions of myself before faculty meetings and loan payments and gray hairs. The radio played a soft jazz tune. I sang along, tapping my fingers on the steering wheel. The city disappeared behind me. The road stretched long and quiet, winding between trees, already turning gold and russet. I rolled down the window halfway, letting the wind rush in. My scarf fluttered behind me. For a moment, I was a different woman, a younger one unburdened by routines and secrets she didn't know existed. Thorn Hollow appeared like it always had, quaint, still a painting more than a village. I slowed as I approached Elias's childhood home, a small wooden cottage with carved window frames and a fading white fence. The front garden was in bloom with late dahlias and sleepy roses. The sun fell gently over the roof, and everything looked peaceful. I parked by the gate, reached into the back seat for the bag, and stepped out. And that's when I saw them. On the porch stood Elias. His back was turned, but I would know that posture anywhere, shoulders slightly hunched, one hand gesturing mid-sentence. Opposite him stood a woman, not his mother. She was holding a child. A boy. No older than 5. I blinked. My breath caught. I took one step closer, then stopped behind the garden hedge. The woman shifted the child in her arms, brushing a hand through his hair. Then the boy reached out toward Elias' daddy. The words sliced through the still air like a knife. My grip loosened. The bag in my hand tilted. A jar of pear jam slipped and cracked open on the stone path, seeping slowly like honeyed blood. I didn't move. I couldn't. Have you ever felt that? When a single moment tears apart the entire world you thought you could trust. If you were Clara, what would you do? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to know how Clara faced the truth, keep watching. Before that moment on the porch, before the word daddy shattered the last illusion I held, my life with Elias had been calm, not passionate in the way novels often described, but steady like the tick of a metronome in a quiet room. In many ways, I think I preferred it that way. Our apartment at Waverly Heights sat on the 4th floor, overlooking an old sycamore tree that bloomed recklessly in spring and turned copper in autumn. The walls were lined with books, classics, mostly Tolstoy, Faulkner, Morrison, Eliot. The spines were worn soft from my fingers. Elias once joked that I'd built a library for a world I couldn't control. He wasn't wrong. We met at a university fundraiser. He'd been dragged there by a mutual friend from the engineering department. I'd been half hoping for wine and silence. Instead, I found a man standing stiffly near the cheese table, inspecting the structural design of the glass wine rack. I asked him if he was evaluating it for safety or poetry. He blinked, smiled awkwardly, and said, "Definitely not poetry." 2 years later, we were married. He was everything I wasn't. I carried emotion like a second skin. Elias kept his folded and hidden tight as blueprints, but he was gentle in ways that mattered. When my father passed, he didn't say anything dramatic. He simply came home early every night. That week warmed my dinner and read aloud from Leaves of Grass until I fell asleep. When I miscarried twice, he didn't offer platitudes. He sat beside me in silence, holding my hand, while I stared out the window for hours. Those silences said more than words ever could. For the past 5 years, our routine had become sacred. He left every Sunday morning at 8. I'd pack the food, he'd double knot his shoes, check the tire pressure, and kiss me on the forehead before disappearing into the soft hum of rural roads. By evening, he'd return with dirt on his jeans and stories about rotting fences, wasps in the attic, or his mother's vegetable garden. I would ask questions. He would answer. Then we'd eat dinner on the balcony and listen to Mahler or Debussy. But somewhere in the last 6 months, something slipped. It was subtle at first, a pause too long before answering me, a kiss that didn't linger. Nights where he'd stand by the window, arms crossed, watching the city below, but not really seeing it. I remember asking him once softly, "Are you all right?" He had smiled and said, "Just tired. The project's a mess." I believed him, but then came the missed text, the change in scent. He'd come home smelling not just of grass and sweat, but of something else, fabric softener that wasn't ours, a faint trace of vanilla. And the way he touched me, still gentle but absent, like a man reaching through fog, I ignored it. I wanted to believe that love once built stayed steady, that if you gave someone everything, your trust, your time, your best intentions, they wouldn't need anything else. And Elias had never been cruel. He never shouted, never belittled, never threatened. He was calm, logical, composed. That was the danger of men like him. The lies weren't loud. They didn't arrive with lipstick stains or late-night voicemails. They came slowly, wrapped in silence, in routine and half smiles and missed glances, in the hope that maybe you were just imagining things. I thought of one evening just 2 weeks before that Saturday. We were sitting in the living room. I had just finished grading papers, and he had poured us both tea. I read aloud from the Brothers Karamazov, a passage about honesty, betrayal, and what it meant to live with a divided soul. When I finished, I turned to him and said, "Do you think people can live 2 lives and still be good?" He looked at me, really looked at me, then set his cup down and said, "I think people try." I smiled. "That's a non-answer," he shrugged. "Life is full of them." At the time I laughed. I thought it was clever. Now it feels like a confession. He still made me coffee every morning, still adjusted the thermostat when I curled up on the couch, cold and tired. Still left notes in my books, underlined lines, like, "It's easier to lie than to explain why you're hurting." I used to think he was being thoughtful. Now I wonder if he was begging to be caught. I wish I could say I sensed something massive was coming. But the truth is I didn't. I was still packing food in glass containers, still tucking in napkins, still waiting by the window every Sunday evening, watching the headlights roll back into our little street. I was still asking, "How are your parents?" and hearing answers like, "Fine, tired, Dad's knees are worse." I was still in love. And that might be the most painful part of all. It was the first Saturday in October, and the light fell golden across the city, soft and slanted, the way it only does when summer has fully surrendered. I woke up early, the idea already planted in my mind. Surprise him, it came gently, like the rising sun through our linen curtains. Elias had left before dawn to review structural schematics with his team. I had the apartment to myself, and with it the quiet satisfaction of preparing something purely out of love. I moved slowly in the kitchen, measuring more by instinct than recipe. The tomato jam had cooled overnight. I scooped it carefully into a small jar and secured the lid. Beside it, I placed the pickled beets, the carrot muffins, a container of mushroom barley soup. I even folded one of our cloth napkins around a small packet of honeyed almonds. I wasn't just packing food. I was sending part of myself, the part that still believed in comfort, care, and constancy. Once everything was packed into the canvas tote, I checked the weather, clear cold. I wrapped myself in a long wool coat and pulled on boots I hadn't worn since spring. The smell of dried leaves greeted me the moment I stepped outside. I stood on the street for a long breath, letting the crisp air settle into my lungs. By the time I was on the highway, the city had shrunk behind me. Ahead, the landscape unrolled like a memory I'd never had but somehow recognized. Cornfields bowed to the wind, birch trees lined the shoulders of the road, their leaves already turning to fire. I turned on the radio. Debussy again, one of Elias's favorites. Claire de Lune whispered softly through the speakers. The tote sat in the passenger seat, its contents shifting gently with each curve of the road. I reached out and placed a hand on it, almost as if I could reassure it, "We're almost there." As the miles slipped by, I let myself drift into memory. I thought about our first road trip when Elias had driven us into the mountains, and I'd insisted on reading Whitman aloud, despite his protests that he couldn't concentrate. I thought about our wedding day, the simplicity of it. Just us and 10 guests under a weeping willow. I thought about the Sunday 2 years ago, when Elias came home from Thorn Hollow with a wooden birdhouse his father had built for me, shaped like the tower of a Russian cathedral. It all felt so far away now, not gone but distant, like music you can hear from another room. I passed the wooden sign that marked the border of Thorn Hollow. The town was unchanged, a scattering of homes, a post office, 2 bakeries that always seemed closed, and the gas station that carried homemade cinnamon rolls. I smiled, remembering how Elias once said those rolls were better than anything I could bake. I had pretended to be offended. He had kissed me behind the ear and whispered, "Almost better." I turned onto the dirt road that led to his childhood home. The tires crunched gently beneath me. As the trees cleared, I saw it, the cottage with its white porch railing, and the garden full of marigolds and asters. I parked a few feet from the gate. The air felt different now. I stepped out and paused, bag in hand. From where I stood, I could see the front porch, and I could see him, Elias. He was standing with his back half turned, his body angled towards someone just inside the doorway. He was speaking softly, so softly I couldn't make out a word. And then the woman stepped forward. She was holding a child, a boy no older than 5. He wore a blue jacket with little patches on the sleeves and clutched a wooden truck in one hand. The woman, tall, light brown hair tied loosely back, looked tired but calm. She adjusted the boy on her hip, and then he wriggled down. That's when it happened. He ran straight to Elias' daddy. The boy called out, arms flung wide. And Elias. He didn't hesitate. He knelt, scooped the child into his arms, and pressed his forehead to the boy's hair. He said something. I couldn't hear it. I didn't need to. His face said everything. Soft, devoted, happy. I couldn't breathe. The wind picked up slightly, carrying the scent of wood smoke and something sweet, fresh bread maybe, or boiled apples. I tasted ash. My fingers trembled. The canvas strap slipped from my shoulder. The bag dropped to the ground with a dull thud. One of the glass jars rolled free and cracked open against the stones. The tomato jam oozed across the gravel like blood. I backed away step by step until the garden hedge obscured them. I leaned against the side of the car. heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. What was this? A cousin? A friend's child? No, no. I'd seen it. I'd seen the way Elias held him. The way the child had said that word with such certainty. Daddy. I gripped the edge of the car trying to steady myself, but my vision blurred. I could still hear the boy's voice echoing in my skull. Daddy, it kept repeating, not as a word but as a verdict, as a confession I had never asked for. The engine roared louder than I remembered. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Gravel spat from beneath the tires as I turned the car around. Heart-racing vision clouded with tears I didn't even feel forming. I didn't look back. The image was already burned into my mind. Elias kneeling in front of that little boy, the warmth in his voice, the tenderness in his touch. The way he smiled, I had seen that smile before on our wedding day in the early mornings, when we read together after the first ultrasound that ended in heartbreak. But he had never smiled at me like that while holding our child, because there had never been one. The road blurred beneath me. Leaves flashed by in streaks of orange and red, and the sky darkened even though the sun hadn't moved. I didn't know where I was going. I only knew I had to move. I had to escape the scene behind me before it swallowed me whole. I was shaking. I pulled over to the side of the road and killed the engine. The silence was immediate. It rang in my ears louder than the car had. I lowered my head to the steering wheel and let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Then another, and another. I couldn't scream. There was no voice left in me. Shock has a way of freezing you not just in body but in identity. You forget who you are, where you were going, why you ever believed anything at all. I don't know how long I sat there, parked between two tall oaks with fading leaves drifting down like ash. At some point, I reached into the glove box and found a packet of tissues. My fingers were numb. I wiped my face mechanically like I was removing makeup after a long day. Not the tears of a woman whose entire world had just been shattered. My phone buzzed. A message from Elias. Are you home? I'm leaving the village now. Should be back before 7. That was all just another Sunday routine. Except it was Saturday, and he wasn't at his parents' house. He was with her and with the boy who called him Daddy. My vision blurred again, not from tears but fury. He was still lying, still pretending, still hiding. I could have driven home, waited for him, thrown the truth in his face, and demanded answers. I could have screamed, cried, thrown plates, packed a suitcase. But something stopped me, a small, sharp part of me that had been silent until now. I didn't want rage, I wanted clarity. I didn't just want to know what he had done. I wanted to know who he had become. I wanted the full story, the shape of the lie, the depth of the betrayal. I didn't want fragments shouted through tears. I wanted evidence, understanding. I wanted the truth on my own terms, and to do that, I had to step out of my pain and into control. I started the car again and drove slower this time. Not toward the city, not toward home. Toward silence, toward planning. Toward Thorn Hollow. That night I didn't sleep. I sat in the kitchen with my notebook, the one I used to draft lectures, and listed every memory that now felt suspicious. The skipped dinners, the vague stories, the softness in Elias's eyes when I asked about his parents, and how it never quite matched the words he used. It had been there all along. I simply hadn't wanted to see it, but now I did. And I was going to find out everything. The next morning I called the university and said I needed a few days off. No details, just quiet. Then I searched online for architectural references in Thorn Hollow, old houses, historic preservation projects, anything I could use to build a reason for visiting the town again. It felt ridiculous, but it gave me something to hold on to by noon. I had a story. I was writing an article for a university journal on rural architecture. I'd heard of a house in Thorn Hollow with rare mid-century woodwork. I wanted to study it, photograph it, talk to the residents. Absurd but plausible, and it gave me the cover I needed. The next day I drove back, the same roads, the same trees. But nothing looked the same. I had changed, and I didn't come as Clara Voss, the betrayed wife. I came as someone else. An observer. A woman who knew the world had broken but refused to shatter with it. The cottage looked quiet as I parked nearby. The air was crisp, the scent of wood smoke curled in the breeze. I fixed my scarf, took a deep breath, and stepped toward the gate. The woman was in the garden this time. She was pruning something by the fence, lavender maybe. She looked up when she heard my footsteps. Her face was calmer than I remembered, still tired, but softer. She didn't flinch when I approached. Didn't look defensive. I forced a smile. "Hello," I said. "I heard you have a very interesting house. I'm writing about rural home design." I was hoping I could ask a few questions. She looked at me for a moment, then she nodded. "Sure," she said. "I'm Maeve." I smiled again, only this time it wasn't forced. "My name's Irina," I replied. "Thank you for your time," and just like that I stepped into her world. Not as a victim, but as a woman reclaiming her story. The scent of freshly baked bread met me before the door did, inside Maple Drift Cottage. The light was warm, low, soft golden rays slanting in through lace curtains, touching wooden beams that had bowed slightly with age. There were no grand chandeliers, no polished surfaces. Just a clean lived-in home with scuffed floorboards and a faint hum of something simmering on the stove. Maeve moved slowly, her body speaking a quiet language of fatigue. Not from the day, but from years. She offered me tea. I accepted. We sat at a small round table near the window, its surface cluttered with a child's crayon drawings and a bowl of cooling porridge. There were 2 mugs, hers, chipped slightly at the rim. She poured the water without asking how I took it, and somehow that felt right. The silence between us wasn't tense, it was full in the corner. The boy Noel played with a set of wooden blocks, humming to himself. He didn't seem fearful or shy, just observant. His small eyes flicked between us, and every now and then he'd glance at Maeve for reassurance. "He's beautiful," I said softly. She nodded. "His name is Noel." Of course it was. She didn't ask mine again. Either she didn't care or she already knew. And I wasn't ready to correct her. Not yet. "How long have you lived here?" I asked. "Couple of years." She looked out the window as she said it, as if trying to measure time by the trees beyond the fence. "Moved back when things changed." I stirred my tea. "Is it just the 2 of you?" She turned her eyes to me. Then, direct, calm. "Mostly." I waited. She didn't blink. "Elias comes by sometimes," she added finally. "Helps with things, chores, errands." It's kind of a routine now. The name dropped like a stone into the center of the table. There was no flicker of hesitation in her voice. No apology, no defensiveness, just statement, fact. I kept my voice steady. "He's my husband." A breath, a pause. Then she nodded. I figured I didn't know what to expect. Shock, guilt, maybe even anger. But what I got was something different entirely. "I didn't know he never told you," she said. "Until the other day, when I saw your face." Silence wrapped the room again. Even Noel had stopped humming. "Why?" I asked. "Why didn't you tell me?" Maeve's lips pressed together in a line, not cold but tired. She took a sip from her mug, then exhaled slowly, "Because it wasn't mine to tell. And because I thought, maybe you already knew I didn't." I see that now. I looked at her, really looked at her. This wasn't a woman who had broken a home. This wasn't some shadowy seductress, hidden away in a quiet village. She was ordinary, tired, real. With dark circles under her eyes and kindness tucked somewhere behind resignation, she'd let me in. And now I was the one who didn't know where to place my anger. Was it I started, then stopped, rephrased? Was it serious between you 2? Maeve gave a strange little smile, one corner of her mouth lifting without joy. "Once a long time ago. Before you." My stomach twisted. "Then why keep this going, Noel?" she said, as simply as if she were naming the weather. "He's his father, and he's a good one. I don't love Elias. Not anymore. But I love that Noel has him." I nodded, though. I didn't know if I agreed. "What about me?" I asked, and my voice cracked on the last word. Did he ever think about me? What this would do to me? "Yes," she said. "That's the problem." I blinked. "He was afraid," she continued. "Afraid of hurting you, afraid of losing you. So he lied. Not because he didn't care, but because he cared too much and not in the right way." "That's cowardice," "Yes," Maeve said. "But cowardice isn't the same as cruelty." That silenced me. I looked down at my tea. It had gone cold. In the corner, Noel stacked 2 more blocks and knocked them over with a satisfied clap. He laughed, a soft, high-pitched sound that punched straight through my ribs. "He doesn't know," I whispered. "About me, no," Maeve said. "Just that sometimes his dad leaves and comes back. And when he does, he brings books and cinnamon rolls, and that he loves him. That's all he knows. He's lucky." Yes, I stood slowly. My legs felt unsteady, like I'd been sitting too long on a train that had stopped, but the motion still lived in my bones. Maeve stood too. I don't hate you, I said. I don't want you to, she replied. And I believed her. I walked toward the door, and Noel looked up. Our eyes met. In his, there was no fear, no confusion, just curiosity, as if I were another storybook character comes to life. I smiled. He smiled back. And in that moment, I felt something shift. Not forgiveness, not yet, but direction. I turned to Maeve. Thank you for the tea. Thank you for listening. I stepped outside, the autumn air catching at my scarf. Behind me, the door closed with a soft click. And for the first time since I saw that child run into Elias's arms, I didn't feel like a woman unraveling. I felt like a woman beginning again. When I stepped back into our apartment at Waverly Heights, it was almost evening. The sun had dipped low, casting long rectangles of light across the wooden floor. The smell of basil and warm air hung in the kitchen remnants of a day I hadn't been part of. My scarf was still draped over the coat rack, just as I had left it. Nothing had changed. Except everything had. Elias was sitting on the edge of the couch, hands folded between his knees. When he looked up, I saw it: recognition, fear, something like relief, all tangled in his expression. He stood. Clara, I set my keys on the table and said nothing. He didn't ask where I'd been. He knew I saw you, I said, voice even. At the house, with Maeve, with Noel. He inhaled sharply. His mouth opened, then closed again. A single muscle in his jaw twitched. Then he nodded. I didn't plan to lie this long, he said. Then why did you? His shoulders sank. Because I didn't know how to tell you. Because I thought, if you found out, I'd lose you. I sat down across from him. Not on the couch, but the armchair near the window. The air between us stretched taut, like a bridge strung between two cliffs. He rubbed his hands together. It was one time. Years ago, before I met you, Maeve and I were never serious. We weren't even really together. It was a moment. And then we went our separate ways. And Noel, she told me 2 years later. After we were already married, I didn't know until then. My throat tightened. You said nothing. I didn't want to hurt you. I thought I could manage both lives, quietly, respectfully. I wasn't with Maeve. I never went back to her, but I couldn't abandon my son. He said son, like it still surprised him, like he was still trying the word on. And what about me? I asked, my voice low. What about the woman who thought she had all of you? You do, he said too quickly. No, I had half, maybe less. He looked down. I watched you hold him. I continued. The way you smiled. The way he called you Daddy. I've never seen that look on your face. Not for me, not for us. It's different, he whispered. That's the problem. Silence wrapped the room again. Outside, a car passed by, its engine humming like a distant storm. I never stopped loving you, he said. I want you to believe that. But you didn't trust me, I replied. You didn't think I could handle the truth. That's not love. Elias, that's control. He flinched. I was wrong, he said. Yes, I agreed. We sat there for a long time, not arguing, not even grieving, just existing, two people with too many shared years and not enough shared honesty. Eventually I stood. I'm going to bed. He looked up. I'll take the couch. He said, no, we're not punishing anyone tonight. We're just here. He followed me into the bedroom, wordless. We lay on opposite sides of the bed. I stared at the ceiling. He faced the wall. The space between us felt wider than the room itself. My body was still, but my mind spun. I thought of the boy Noel, of his laugh, of the way he looked at Maeve, then at me, not knowing I was the ghost in his father's other life. I thought of Maeve's tired kindness, of her quiet truthfulness, of how she never once blamed me even though I'd had the man she once loved. I thought of Elias, of the man I thought I knew, the man who made coffee every morning, who read poetry at night, who measured time in schedules and silence. I had fallen in love with his steadiness, but it was that same steadiness that had masked a lie too large to carry. The truth had weight, and now it lived in this bed with us. At some point, I drifted into sleep. Not restful, not deep, just enough to forget for a moment that I was holding broken promises in my chest. The next morning, I woke to the smell of toast and eggs. Elias was in the kitchen, moving slowly, like someone unsure if he belonged. He turned when I entered. I made breakfast. He said, I thought maybe we could talk more. I nodded. We will, but not today. Not now, I added. He didn't push. Instead, he poured me coffee the way he always had, 2 sugars, no cream, and set it on the table. Without looking up, I sat. And for the first time in our marriage, I drank it in silence, not out of comfort, but out of choice. I left the next morning, not with a suitcase, not in anger, but with a bag of clothes, 2 books, and the quiet permission to be alone. I didn't tell Elias where I was going. I just told him softly but firmly, I need time. And to his credit, he didn't ask questions. He nodded, stood in the doorway of our apartment, and let me go. I drove north, away from the city, through roads flanked by trees shedding their last gold. It was a place I hadn't been in years. An old family dacha tucked between 2 hills, hidden behind thickets of pine and birch, no neighbors, no signal, just silence and sky. It used to be my retreat when grading became too much, when grief from my father's death still sat too close to the surface. The house wasn't much, 2 rooms, a wood stove, shelves of books I hadn't touched in ages, but it was mine. Untouched by Elias, by marriage, by memory, I lit the stove, boiled water, unpacked slowly. The place smelled faintly of cedar and dust. I opened the windows to let autumn in. For the first time in days, I exhaled without trembling. That first night I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I sat by the window and stared into the trees, listening to the wind comb through the branches. I remembered the boy's voice. Daddy, how sure it sounded. I remembered Maeve's face and how she didn't look like someone who'd won. She looked like someone who'd settled, survived. And I remembered Elias not as a villain, but as a man who'd folded his shame into silence and hoped I'd never unfold it. I didn't know how to feel about that, so I didn't decide. The days passed quietly. I read, walked along the tree lines, picked up pine cones, and stacked firewood. I wrote in a journal without structure, just thoughts, questions, fragments. I reread Anna Karenina and found myself underlining passages I'd skimmed before. Words about dignity, about sorrow without performance. Each morning, I brewed coffee on the stove and drank it on the porch. The quiet settled into my bones like warmth. I kept thinking of the question I had asked Elias once, weeks before everything crumbled. Do you think people can live 2 lives and still be good? He hadn't answered then. But now I tried to. And the truth is, I didn't know. I only knew that people can live 2 truths, that someone can love you deeply and still fail you completely. That betrayal doesn't always look like abandonment. Sometimes it looks like protection carried too far, like silence wrapped in good intentions, like a man trying to be everything to everyone until he is barely anything at all. One evening I stood in front of the mirror and didn't recognize myself, not in a dramatic way, but quietly. My eyes looked older, not sadder, just opened. That was the moment I knew whatever came next, I wasn't going to live blind. After 6 days, I texted Elias. I'll be home tomorrow. I'd like to talk. He replied almost instantly. I'll be here. I didn't know what I was walking into. I didn't even know what I was going to say. I just knew I was ready not to forgive. Not to forget, but to confront. To rebuild maybe, or to close the book. But on my terms, when I got home, the apartment was cleaner than usual. Elias had lit a candle in the kitchen. Not romantic, just warm. He stood when I entered. I took off my coat, set down my bag. Then I looked at him. Not as a wife to a husband, but as a woman to a man. I'm not the same, I said. He nodded. I didn't expect you to be. We sat. He didn't speak first, so I did. I've decided I'm not going to leave. Not yet, but that doesn't mean I've forgiven you, or that things can go back to the way they were. I understand I need to see everything clearly. No more secrets, no more protection. If we're going to do this, we rebuild from truth. From zero, I want that, he said. Do you? He looked at me, and this time I believed him. Yes, we didn't embrace, we didn't kiss. We sat across from each other, 2 people with a broken foundation and a choice, run or rebuild. I chose to stay, but I stayed as someone new. Not as the quiet wife in the armchair, but as Clara Voss, still wounded, still uncertain, but no longer naive. It had been 2 weeks since the conversation, 2 weeks since I walked through the front door, not as someone forgiving, but as someone choosing for herself. Elias hadn't pushed. He moved through our shared space with quiet respect. As if he finally understood the fragility of my presence, we talked about the boy, about Maeve, about the years of silence he'd buried beneath chore routines and bedtime poetry. Sometimes we said too little, sometimes too much, but we said it. And then one morning over coffee, I said something I never thought I would. I want to meet them. Officially, Elias looked up from his cup. Are you sure? No, I admitted, but I think it's time. We drove out to Thorn Hollow the next Saturday, the same road, the same trees, now thinner, barer. The wind had picked up, the air smelled of early frost. In the back seat was a linen bag filled with hand pies, spiced apples, and a small wooden puzzle I'd found at a bookstore, a gift for Noel. I didn't know what to expect. I only knew I didn't want my life to be ruled by what I couldn't face. As we approached Maple Drift Cottage, Elias grew quiet. His hands gripped the wheel a little tighter. I reached over and rested mine gently over his. He exhaled. Maeve was already outside when we pulled up. She was trimming the last of the garden's flowers. Her sleeves rolled up, a strand of hair pulled behind one ear. She saw us straightened. Weighted Noel peeked from behind her small fingers, gripping her coat. We got out slowly. I took the bag from the back seat and walked beside Elias toward the gate. Maeve opened it without a word. I knew you'd come, she said quietly. I nodded. I wasn't sure I would. She smiled, tired but real. But you did. Noel clung to her leg, peering up at me. This is Anna, Maeve said, using the name I'd given her weeks before. I looked at him gently. Not quite, I'm Clara. He blinked, then smiled. I crouched down. Hi, Noel. Hi, he said, voice soft. Curious? I opened the bag, pulled out the puzzle, and held it toward him. I brought you something. He took it with both hands, wide-eyed, then scurried back behind Maeve to examine it. Inside the cottage was warmer than I remembered. The smell of baked oats and lavender still lingered in the corners. We sat around the same table. Elias poured tea this time. Maeve sliced one of the hand pies and placed it on a small plate for Noel. The conversation started clumsy. Weather school, the price of heating oil, but slowly it softened. We weren't three adults navigating betrayal anymore. We were four people, one small and curious, navigating something stranger than forgiveness. Acceptance, not of choices, but of circumstance. Noel climbed into Elias's lap and showed him the puzzle. His small voice bright with excitement, I watched Elias listen, nod, smile. A father's smile. No guilt, no shame, just love. I didn't feel replaced. I felt repurposed. Maeve noticed. You okay? She asked softly. I looked at her. Surprisingly, you're brave? No, just tired of carrying anger. She nodded. It weighs more than people think. There was silence, and in that silence something shifted again. Not erasure, but possibility. When we left that afternoon, Noel ran to the gate behind us, waving with both arms. His cheeks were red from the cold, his eyes bright, his grin wide. Bye, Clara, he called. Bye, sweetheart. I meant it. Elias and I didn't speak much on the drive home, but he reached for my hand halfway down the road, and I didn't pull away. The leaves fell around us like soft, rustling forgiveness. That night back in the apartment, I unpacked the now empty linen bag and folded it away. Elias leaned in the doorway. Thank you, he said. For today I turned to face him. I didn't do it for you. I said I did it for me. He nodded. I know. Then after a pause, and maybe, right, for him too, I thought of Noel. His eyes, his smile, the way he'd looked at me without knowing who I was and still welcomed me. Yes, I said quietly. Maybe for him too. People think betrayal ends a marriage, but sometimes it just peels away the fantasy and leaves you with the truth. And you have to decide if that truth is something you can live with or walk away from. For me, walking away would have been easy, silencing him, burning bridges, starting over with rage as fuel. But staying took something else. It took grit. It took silence. It took listening to a woman I was supposed to hate and finding grace in her eyes. It took looking at a little boy and realizing that he was never my enemy. He was Elias's echo, a living thread between what had been hidden and what had been real. I didn't stay because I was weak. I stayed because I was different, because I no longer saw love as possession. Because Elias and I weren't the same people who got married beneath the willow tree. We had broken something and then together picked up the pieces and examined what was worth saving. Not everything was, but enough was. We are not perfect now. There are still silences, still questions. But there's also room for Noel, for truth, for Maeve's tired kindness, for the woman I've become. Some people may never understand my choice. Some people may call it settling. But here's what I believe. Forgiveness isn't weakness. Compassion isn't foolishness. And staying isn't failure when it's chosen with your eyes open. So if you've ever stood at a crossroads with heartbreak in one hand and a map in the other, just know this. You don't owe anyone a dramatic ending. You owe yourself peace. And sometimes, peace looks like tea with the woman your husband once loved, and a small boy calling you by name. What did you think of Clara's story? Would you have made the same choice or walked away? Let me know where you're watching from in the comments. And if you believe Clara found her quiet strength, vote number 8. If you think forgiveness should never be an option, vote number 3. Don't forget to subscribe to EN True Tales for more powerful emotional stories every week, where endings aren't perfect but always honest.